On the evening of Sunday, November 13th, 1994, the Chesley family returned from town exhausted. Sundays always beat the weekdays for the most busy and tiring day of the week. The Chesleys would have loved to rest and recuperate as the good Lord intended, but the 45-minute drive into town necessitated that they do as many of their weekly errands on Sundays when they went to town for church as possible. The whole family volunteered before and after church with Sunday school, childcare, and ushering. Once released from their duties, they went shopping at Farm and Fleet for anything they needed for their massive 2-acre garden, which included a broad variety of vegetables and greens plus a small orchard. Finally, they went to Costco for human supplies, food, toilet paper, soap, etc. These tasks combined made for a mentally exhausting day, and the family always returned home as zombies. Wayne Chesley pulled their red Dodge Grand Caravan into their detached garage. He was ready for a nap. Fortunately, they had picked up enough frozen pizza to feed the 5 of them for dinner that night, so nobody needed to cook. The 3 Chesley children, Conrad, Rosemary, and Amos, all climbed out while Wayne and his wife Amanda took a moment to stretch their backs before opening their own doors and exiting the van. "Hey kids, don't forget to help with the groceries," Wayne called after the children as they walked toward the house. Conrad, the oldest at 15, groaned and turned back. Rosemary, 12, pretended not to hear her father over her Walkman blaring through her headphones. But her 7-year-old brother Amos grabbed her arm and looked up at her innocently. "Dad says we need to help with the groceries," he told her, believing she truly had not heard. Rosemary rolled her eyes, turned up her music, and walked back to the van. With armfuls of bags, the 5 Chesleys waddled around the house to the front porch. Conrad reached the stairs first, and there, he stopped. His mother Amanda, Wayne, Amos, and, lagging far behind, Rosemary, stopped too when they saw what waited for them at the top of the porch steps. A fat butternut squash with little black eyes, a big, round nose, and a long frown drawn on it with Sharpie. It sat straight up, staring at them all as they gazed upon it with apprehensive curiosity. "Is that from our garden?" Amanda asked, going around Conrad for a closer look. She set down a bag of groceries and reached out her hand to touch the squash, but retracted it at the very last second. "What is it?" asked Wayne. Amanda said, "Oh, nothing. It's just bizarre." Wayne climbed the steps and pushed the squash aside with his foot. As he searched his pockets for the keys, the kids walked onto the porch one at a time. Amanda took up the rear, studying the sad squash on her way up the steps. Who could have left it there? There wasn't another house or business for miles. She couldn't imagine someone would have stopped off the highway that ran by the house just to draw on a squash and leave it on the steps. But if they did, intending to spook the poor family that lived on the isolated acreage, they had certainly succeeded. Conrad helped his mom put away the groceries while fielding her questions. "Do you think one of your friends might have done that thing with the squash?" "I can ask." "You'd tell me if you did it, right?" "I didn't do it, Mom. It's such a dumb prank anyway." "Why would somebody do it, though?" "Maybe it was a dare, or..." Conrad stopped when he realized his mother's question had been rhetorical. She now stood frozen with a carton of eggs in her hand, halfway into the fridge, staring over her own shoulder, wide-eyed. "Mom, what is it?" "Wayne?" Amanda called out, still frozen in action. "Yeah, what is it?" Wayne called back from another room. "Could you come in here?" Spurred by the anxiety in her tone, Wayne hurried into the kitchen. Amanda only moved again once he was in sight. He went straight to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She pushed him back gingerly. "Have you checked all the doors and windows? Were they locked?" Wayne said, "While we were gone earlier? I think so, but I didn't check. Would you like me to?" "I'd feel much better." "Because of the squash thing?" Wayne asked. Amanda looked away, but after a stoic moment, nodded. She asked, Could you send the younger kids in here with me? I just want them in sight while you look around." "Want me to give the whole house a once-over?" he asked. Again, she nodded, and Wayne told Conrad, "Why don't you tell your siblings to come in the kitchen and you come with me? This'll go way faster with two of us." "Just don't split up," Amanda pleaded. In unison, Conrad and Wayne replied, "We won't." Rosemary and Amos entered the kitchen under the assumption that they were supposed to help with the groceries. Conrad followed Wayne from room to room, checking every window lock. After securing the ground floor, they went upstairs. In his own room, Conrad picked up his baseball bat. He gave it a test swing, then peeked under his bed and in his closet before also checking his window. He never left his window open, so he knew it was locked even before he checked. The only unlocked window Wayne and Conrad found upstairs was in Rosemary's room. She kept it open all the time and regularly climbed out onto the roof over the wraparound porch that ran beneath all of their bedroom windows. But she claimed she had shut and locked her window before they went to church that morning. She told Wayne she had unlocked and opened it again after they got home. Even so, Wayne paid extra attention to Rosemary's room as he searched for any hidden intruders. He and Conrad searched the basement, and for Amanda's sake, Wayne even checked the attic. It seemed whoever had left the squash didn't stick around. They decided it must have been an innocent prank, as Conrad originally guessed. Conrad stepped outside to have his own look around. He checked the padlock on the garden shed and found it secure. He looked out over the empty fields in every direction, wondering which way the prankster came from and which way they went. He still had the baseball bat in his hands, and when he returned to the porch, he used it to roll the squash onto its back in order to study its face. Some of the Sharpie had smeared, yet still, the face looked strangely alive. He used the toe of his shoe to roll the squash to the edge of the stairs, then stopped it. He stepped back, twirling his bat. He planted his feet shoulder-width apart, found his base, and said, "This is for scaring my mom." With one perfect swing, he smashed the bat into the squash, caving in the frowning face as he sent it flying. It landed in the grass with its battered innards turned up toward the darkening sky. The sad squash plagued little Amos's nightmares that night. The vandalized gourd played a smaller role in the dreams than the tension it brought into the house. Amos hadn't liked it when Daddy and Conrad were going around the house looking for a bad guy. The whole time they were looking, he was scared they were going to find a bad guy and have to fight him. He didn't know if Daddy knew how to fight, but he knew Conrad didn't for sure. He didn't tell anyone about his nightmares the next morning, not that he remembered much about them. Their perturbation lingered with him all morning, though, as he tried to sit through his second-grade lessons. That afternoon, after his schoolwork was done, Amos went outside to play in the yard. Amanda forced Conrad and Rosemary to go out too. The remnants of the squash still lay in the front yard, crawling with autumn's most enduring insects. Rosemary recommended they play hide and seek, one of the few games Conrad didn't act too cool to play yet. The others, with no better ideas, agreed, but they made Rosemary count first. Amos sprinted across the acreage to the garden shed and dove behind it just as he heard Rosemary call, "Ready or not, here I come." He crouched, panting for at least a minute, attempting to keep his breath quiet enough for the slight breeze to disguise. He felt a sneeze rising behind his nose and turned his head to stifle it. What he saw, sitting beside him, scared the sneeze away. Someone had left a second squash, slightly smaller than the one on the porch with an equally unsettling frown, behind the tool shed next to a stack of cinder blocks his daddy kept back there. His heart palpitated as the unease from his dreams returned, making him feel woozy and sweaty. Amos made two simultaneous realizations. First, he did not want anyone else to see the squash he found. Everyone seemed to have forgotten about the one they found yesterday, and he didn't want to start over with the fear and worry. Second, Rosemary might be closing in. He looked at the squash. He looked at the stack of cinder blocks. Picking up the squash, he stood tall enough to look down the square holes at the top of the cinder block tower. Wayne had stacked the blocks straight enough that the holes matched each other all the way down, block by block, to the ground. "Found you," he heard Rosemary shout somewhere in the near distance. She got Conrad. He was next. He held the squash above one of the square holes and turned it until it fit perfectly through. Then he let it go. It dropped through the first 2 cinder blocks without stopping, but caught halfway through the third. Still, it fell deep enough to hide it, leaving Amos satisfied the second squash would never be found. Unless, that is, his daddy finally did whatever it was he intended to do with the cinder blocks. However, that seemed unlikely, at least in the near future, which is the only future a 7-year-old boy like Amos thinks about. Wednesday nights belonged to Amanda. Besides Sundays, Wednesdays were the only days she regularly drove the 45-minute distance to town. Her weekly Bible study group met at a friend's house at 7, but Amanda usually arrived in town before 5. She liked to visit the library, find a good book, and go read at the wine bar downtown with a glass of anything red and a personal charcuterie board. This solitary ritual, followed by the social stimulation of Bible study, reliably kept Amanda's batteries charged for the rest of the week. On the Wednesday night following the squash discoveries, Amanda planned to drive into town as usual, but she could not find her van keys anywhere. She hadn't needed them since Sunday, so she went down to the laundry room in the basement to search through the pockets of the outfit she wore that day. Still empty-handed, she double-checked all of her coats, the drawer in the entryway table, and a few places in her bedroom, all places she may have conceivably set the keys while going about her Sunday evening routine. "Wayne, have you seen the keys anywhere?" she asked when she was finally ready to admit defeat. He answered, "No. You mean yours? I haven't done anything with them." "I can't find them anywhere. I've been looking." "You can take mine if you need them. I don't want you to miss out on your you time." Amanda snapped, "You really think this is a time to blow off a set of missing keys?" Wayne looked at his wife curiously, unsure what she was trying to imply. Then it struck him. "Oh, because of the squash thing?" "What if whoever left that squash on the porch took my keys?" Amanda whispered, conscientious of the children who, though not in sight, never seemed to all be out of earshot. "Amanda, we searched the whole house and nothing's happened since. Have you looked in the purse you took to church? Or maybe you put them down somewhere weird while you were bringing in groceries or putting them away. Have you checked the fridge?" "I would have noticed my keys in the fridge by now, Wayne." "Well, take mine. I'll keep my eyes out for yours while you're gone. I'm sure they're laying around somewhere." Amanda stood in silent thought for a few seconds, then looked at the clock. She already wouldn't get to the library until 5:30, meaning she would have to down her wine quickly if she didn't want to be buzzed at Bible study, and under no circumstances would she change her plans and pass on the wine altogether. In a huff, she said, "Fine." She retrieved Wayne's keys, yelled bye to the kids, and went outside. It was a chilly night. Not yet the sort of bitter cold that puts pins in your skin, but certainly worth zipping your coat for. Amanda had her hands full with library books, her Bible, and her purse, and she had neglected to zip her coat, so she hustled to the garage through the wind, hissing through her teeth. She unlocked the van and opened the back door to put her books on the seat. After closing that door, she opened her own. It was waiting on the passenger seat, frowning at her. Squash number 3. Amanda yelped and nearly dropped her purse. It tipped against the seat and spilled her Bible study notebook onto the dirty garage floor. "Wayne!" she yelled, both frustrated and scared. He cracked open a nearby window in the house and asked, "What is it?" "It's another squash. Same creepy face as last time. It has to be one of the kids, right? Oh, please, God, tell me it's just one of the kids." Wayne went out to the garage. When he reached his wife's side, he grasped her forearm and gently pulled her away from the van so he could look inside. The squash stared back with its teeny, uneven black eyes. Before reacting, he took a beat to assess the possibilities. The squashes had most likely come from their garden, which the kids had unlimited access to. Plus, nobody else lived within miles of them, and he felt sure one of them would have noticed someone stopping by. They had been home all day, except for him while he'd been at work. Besides, the van was probably locked. Whoever left the squash must have had keys. Whoever did it still has the keys, Wayne thought aloud. They would have had to grab them from inside, so it must have been one of the kids, and I bet whichever one it was still has the keys. Probably forgot to take them out of their pocket after they put this guy here. No way it's Amos, right? So I'll go talk to Conrad and Rose and see which one confesses. I want you to go have your night out, and don't come back until you're stress-free, all right? Stress-free? I don't know how you think I can even go anywhere tonight. Wayne, we should call the police. What if it's not one of the kids who has the keys, huh? Whoever has them has access to the van, the house, the shed, the church nursery. As Amanda listed off the keys on her ring, Wayne stopped to pick up her fallen notebook. He happened to glance under the driver's seat on his way down and stopped. Amanda did not notice him reach under the seat and retrieve something as she continued winding herself up. There might be a key to the safe on there. I don't remember. And there's... Honey, Wayne interrupted. She would have kept going, but he held her jingling key ring up in front of her face and grinned. Found him. With a snarl far from the alleviated smile Wayne expected, Amanda snatched the keys out of his hand and began to inventory them, mumbling the identity of each one to herself. Wayne said, "The good news is, if some psycho had stolen them, he wouldn't have left them behind, right? And with every key still accounted for? Come on, Amanda, it was just the kids playing a bad joke. Take your keys, get in the van, and go have a nice time. I'll get to the bottom of this while you're out." Accounting for each and every key, Amanda sighed. She handed Wayne's keys back and put her purse in the passenger seat, replacing the squash, which she took out. "I'll take that too," Wayne said, holding his hands out for the squash. But Amanda set it on the ground and kicked it behind the van's front tire. Wayne said, "Oh, come on, don't make a mess on the garage floor." Amanda blasted through the back of his head with her eyes and slammed the van door shut. Wayne chuckled as he stepped out of her way. The van started without trouble, and Amanda punched it into reverse. The engine roared as she floored the gas, instantly crushing the sad squash under the tire. A few seeds shot out and stuck to Wayne's shoe. He kicked them off and waved at the blinding headlights as Amanda backed out of the driveway and drove off into the night. Days passed without another squash turning up. Despite Wayne and Amanda's pressing, neither Conrad nor Rosemary confessed to leaving them as a prank. Amanda even prodded at Amos to see if they had perhaps misjudged him, but in the end, the mystery remained unsolved. Over time, they all forgot about the squashes. All except Amos, who occasionally thought of the one he dropped into the cinder blocks. As far as he knew, no one had found it yet. Once the weather reports for the first real winter weather started coming in, Wayne announced they would need to harvest the last vegetables out of the garden or lose them altogether. The kids didn't care if those vegetables froze and rotted, but Wayne and Amanda wouldn't have it. They knew they could pass them off to other families at church and give the remainder to the food bank. They refused to let the fruits, or vegetables, of their labor go to waste. They completed the harvest not a day too soon, as the Monday morning after they had gifted the last of the vegetables at church, a brilliant blanket of snow covered the land as far as the eye could see in any direction, and it was still coming down in thick, globular clusters. When Rosemary slipped out of bed that morning, she drew up the blinds and shut her window. She always kept it cracked at night. The cool air helped her sleep, but that morning the temperature had reached an uncomfortable new low. Her room felt like a refrigerator, and a layer of frost crusted the edge of the windowsill. Her eyes adjusted to the bright light coming in after she pushed her window closed, and she noticed a peculiar lump in the snow covering the porch roof just on the other side of the glass. She tried to conjure an image of the uncovered roof to remember. Was there a vent or something there? Maybe one of those little gray boxes she assumed had something to do with the electricity? She couldn't remember. Whatever lay beneath the snow outside looked too big to be either of those things anyway. The lump did not bother her enough to investigate it, so she instead went to her closet for some warm clothes. While dressing, a terrible idea occurred to her. What if the lump outside was some poor squirrel or bird who got close to the house to escape the wind and got buried out there? And what if there was still time to save it? She looked out the window again, studying the lump. The longer she looked, the less she believed it could be a living creature. But still, the idea adhered to her thoughts in a way she could not shake. Bracing against the cold, she raised her window again. She unclipped the screen, twisting it as she brought it inside, then leaned out over the porch. With her face inches from the lump, she recognized its shape. A shape which made Rosemary's cold toes curl. The narrow top and wide bottom of the lump could only be a butternut squash lying on its side. And though she did not really need further confirmation of her suspicion, Rosemary pulled her sleeve down over her palm and brushed the top layer of snow away to reveal a frowning face drawn with Sharpie, staring up at her. "Nuh-uh," she said, covering her other hand the same as the first. Thus protected, she picked up the frozen squash and chucked it over the roof. She watched it spin through the air amongst the snowflakes before falling to the ground out of sight. As an afterthought, she glanced side to side at the blanket covering the roof, searching for any sign of tracks, especially tracks between her window and Conrad's. She now believed her father's suspicion that Conrad had been behind the squash pranks the whole time. Who else had easy access to the porch roof and would do something like that, especially on such a cold and stormy night? It had to be Conrad. Rosemary slammed her window down and huffed out of her room to go confront her brother. As soon as she left, another snow-coated lump on the wraparound roof, around the corner from her window, moved on its own. It stood, rising tall enough to tower above the windows. The massive figure brushed snow off of himself, stretched his cold muscles, and looked over the gutter at the white front lawn below. Rosemary's squash frowned up at him from the bottom of a deep hole in the snow. The man took a Sharpie out of his pocket and raised it to his stubbly face. There, he colored an uneven frown around his chapped blue lips. Replacing the Sharpie's cap and slipping it back into his pocket, he turned toward Rosemary's unlocked window. Downstairs, Rosemary found Wayne and Conrad speculating on how long it would take before their road was cleared off. She accused Conrad of planting the squash outside her window to freak her out, which he vehemently denied. "Can we deal with this later?" Wayne asked his children. Rosemary argued, "No, Dad. Don't you find it at all alarming that somebody left one of those squashes outside my bedroom window last night in the middle of a storm? You're not at all concerned?" Wayne sighed. "Conrad, if you're responsible for this, now would be the time to confess, okay?" "It wasn't me, Dad," Conrad insisted. "Well, that makes 3 of those things that have just randomly shown up," said Rosemary. "If it's not you or Amos, then who is it?" Wayne said, "Okay, you two sort this out. I'm going to go start a pot of coffee and wake up your mom. Maybe she can put together a hot breakfast for us all to eat together when we're done clearing the driveway." He left his 2 eldest children in the entryway and entered the kitchen. Their circular dining table stood in the middle of the room, and in the center of the table rested yet another squash, with, of course, 2 black eyes, a round nose, and a wide, dramatic frown, all drawn in Sharpie, staring back at him. "Kids?" Wayne barked. He waited, frozen, in the entrance to the kitchen. The squash rested in a small puddle, indicating someone may have brought it in from outside. As far as he knew, no one had gone outside yet. In fact, he knew they hadn't because he had been the first one up. "What, Dad?" Conrad asked, joining his father. He was all too eager to escape the roundabout argument with his sister. Wayne said, "Please tell me you did this. Seriously, this has gone far enough. Get out of jail free card. Did you do it?" "Dad, I swear..." A piercing shriek cut Conrad off and made he and his father spin. Wayne fast enough to pull a muscle in his side. Rosemary ran to him, ghost white, breath shaking. She was trying to say something, but the words kept getting jumbled up. "Stay with Conrad," Wayne said, leaving his children at the kitchen and hurrying to where Rosemary had stood before at the base of the stairs. Before he got there, he heard someone coming down. Multiple people. Slowly. "Amanda?" he called out. And in response, he heard a muffled cry. At the base of the stairs, Wayne looked up at his worst nightmare. First coming down the stairs was Amos. His hands were tied behind him, and a piece of neon orange duct tape had been wrapped across his mouth all the way around the back of his head more than once. Both the rope and tape Wayne recognized from his own supplies in the garage. Behind Amos came Amanda, similarly bound but with a length of rope around her feet, allowing them to move only just enough to walk, and then only barely. Trailing Amos and Amanda came the man undoubtedly responsible for the strange squashes popping up in random places. He was enormous, towering head and shoulders above Amanda, even after they stood on the same level at the bottom of the stairs. "What do you want? Whatever it is, take it," Wayne begged. "Please, just let my family go." The man was dressed in layers, appearing to have jeans on beneath his sweatpants. His tattered black coat bulged from the other shirts worn underneath it. On his head, he wore a balaclava with the mask pulled up, covering the lower half of his face. All Wayne could see were his cold eyes, which were so dark he almost appeared to have no irises at all. The man's only response to Wayne's plea was to point with an open penknife toward the kitchen. When Wayne's face expressed intention to resist, the man put the tip of his blade against the side of Amanda's neck and cocked his head as if asking, "Is this what you would prefer?" Helpless, Wayne obeyed. Minutes later, the entire Chesley family sat around the dining room table, bound the same way as Amos and Amanda, with their hands tied behind the backs of their chairs and their feet bound to the chair legs. The giant intruders spaced them all equally around the circular table, with their backs to each other so they could only see the family members in their periphery. None of them risked such a noticeable move as turning their heads. The children, especially Amos, were nervous to perform even the minute movements required to breathe. And in the center of the table, behind them all and projecting the sense it was watching them, rested the final squash Wayne had found when the nightmare began. Their captor disappeared briefly after he trusted that they could not escape. That didn't stop Wayne and Conrad from wiggling their wrists behind their backs trying to loosen the ropes. The imposing man returned without his balaclava and holding Conrad's baseball bat. The very same bat with which Conrad had smashed the first squash all those weeks ago. He paced around the family slowly, making sure each of them saw the sharp frown drawn across his face. Rosemary tried to say something, but the duct tape around her mouth muffled every syllable, making it impossible to even guess at her words. At the end of his circle, the man pivoted to face Conrad. He bowed slightly to look into the young man's eyes. Conrad looked back briefly before his fear overcame him and forced him to look away from the vacuum of sanity he saw behind the giant's eyes. When Conrad looked down, the giant's free hand shot forward and grabbed a fistful of Conrad's hair. With a stiff jerk, he forced the boy's head back until his exposed neck was stretched tight. Then the man released his hair and tapped Conrad's chin with the bat, wordlessly instructing him to hold it still. During this interaction, Wayne continued working against his ropes. He knew the man might notice, but he didn't think it would matter soon anyway. The man was clearly insane and undoubtedly depraved. Wayne's imagination could find no limit to what his family's captor might be capable of. Once he seemed sure Conrad would hold still, the giant took a wide step back, flipped the baseball bat upright, and twisted both hands around the grip. Wayne, on Conrad's right, and Amos, on Conrad's left, both began to howl beneath their gags. Conrad's protest was weaker and higher pitched as he maintained the tension imposed on his throat and awaited what was to come. The man swung the bat behind his shoulder and pivoted, turning his hips. Amanda tried to see what the others were reacting to, but Conrad was positioned almost exactly at her 6 o'clock. She made her chair hop, turning a degree at a time as she tried to see what was going on. Wayne fought harder than ever against his restraints. He had seconds left to keep his family whole, seconds rapidly disappearing into the void of the past. The giant bellowed from his core, loudly enough to reflect off of the kitchen window and make the glass rattle. Then he swung. Amanda had just turned her chair enough to see the bat arc toward her eldest son's upturned head. Her muffled scream alerted Conrad at the last second, just in time for him to duck. The bat went over his head, grazing the back of his hair. The giant wasted no motion or effort. With a brutal upward backswing, he struck the side of Conrad's face, snapping his head back again. Wayne and Amanda both screamed. Amos began to cry. Rosemary still could not see what was happening, but cried as well. With the bat now returned to the ready position, the giant bellowed again. This time, he brought the bat down in the middle of Conrad's face, crushing his nose instantly. Blood spurted, spraying the bat and even spattering across the giant's painted frown. Conrad's head dropped, dripping blood into his lap. The man wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing blood and Sharpie across it, before hoisting the bat above his head and bringing it down again on the back of Conrad's. He performed his next strike even faster. Conrad stopped moving, but still the brutal blows continued until the bat was so covered in blood that each swing sprayed the rest of the family. At the end of his final swing, the man let go of the bat. It crashed into the kitchen cabinets and fell to the floor. The giant grabbed the back of Amos's chair, disregarding the protests of his mother, and spun it around. Amos and Amanda locked eyes and screamed to each other as Amos, still bound to the chair, was dragged backwards out of the kitchen and out of sight. The rest of the family listened to his cries grow fainter as the man pulled him into another room. Wayne rocked his chair back and forth to turn it toward his wife and daughter. Amanda still faced away from him, having turned her own chair, but he was able to see the side of Rosemary's face and the corner of her left eye. She forced her head to turn a little more, and they locked eyes while Wayne was dragged out of the kitchen next. The giant took Rosemary after him, leaving Amanda alone. Amanda had noticed when turning her chair that the legs on one side felt loose and wobbly. When her captor left her alone in the kitchen, she tested how far she could tilt them. Depending on how the chair would fall, she thought she might be able to slip her ropes or at least get her hands in front of herself. She pushed. The chair tilted. Too late. Just as the first splitting cracks began to sound, the giant reappeared in the threshold, almost filling it. Amanda went still and allowed herself to be dragged into the living room with the others. Most of them. "Where's Rosemary?" she asked, but of course all she got out was a series of muffled syllables. Still, Wayne understood her question. He, Amos, and Amanda now all sat in a straight row facing the picture window in the living room. Their view included the porch, the front yard, and the road just beyond. The blanket of blinding snow covering the road and yard disguised any distinction between the two. Wayne looked pointedly toward the staircase, then turned his eyes upward, indicating the man had taken Rosemary upstairs. "Just her? Why?" The worst ideas started knocking at Amanda's mind. The man grabbed the sides of her head and turned it to face outside instead of at Wayne. Then he stepped over to Wayne, but Wayne grunted and turned his own head before he needed to be corrected. The giant then looked at Amos to make sure he, too, was looking out the window, and when he saw he was, left the room. Not daring to watch, they all listened to him trudge upstairs. Wayne devolved into sobs. Beside him, Amanda's chair began to crackle. Amos, who had sat in that wiggly chair countless times before, looked around his father at his mother, eyes wide with expectant excitement. Amanda jerked to the side, resulting in a staccato crack below her. Wayne stopped crying. "Do it," he said, quietly enough that the words actually found some space between his lips and the duct tape to articulate themselves. Amanda locked her fierce eyes with his and nodded. A jerk of the shoulders, a twist of the hip, and the two loose legs gave out, freeing one of her own. Amanda tumbled onto her side, bringing the chair down with her, hard. One of the back posts cracked, and with a bit more twisting, she managed to snap it too. This made the back of the chair pliable enough for her to work her arms under the chair, then around the remaining legs, and finally in front of herself. She freed her other leg and briefly attempted to untie her own wrist restraints, but could not grip the rope tightly enough between any of her fingers. Wayne exclaimed, shaking his own wrists to show her how he had already loosened them somewhat. Amanda hurried to finish the job. As she began to work, they all heard the struggle upstairs begin. First came a pause in the man's clumping footsteps. Then Rosemary's scream, the feet of her chair rocking back and forth. Pulling furiously at Wayne's ropes, Amanda thought, he carried her all the way upstairs in that chair? They heard Rosemary's chair break, followed by a boom that rattled the ducts. Rosemary's screaming melted into crying. Amanda blinked back her own tears. She had to focus. She had to free Wayne so they could go upstairs and... Glass shattered, and something thudded above them, but outside. Clods of snow fell off the roof, leaving a twinkling cloud of flakes in their wake. Rosemary started screaming again, but now her screams came from the porch roof. Amanda groaned. She freed Wayne's left hand. He started working on the right on his own, and Amanda turned her attention to his feet. She freed one, but at the very same moment, Amanda heard another thud outside, and Wayne and Amos screamed mutedly in unison. Unwillingly, but unable to stop herself, Amanda turned to the picture window. Outside, in the middle of the front yard, lay Rosemary's body, face down with clusters of fallen snow already forming on her pajamas. Wayne stood in fury, burning his right hand as he tore the rope from it. He yanked his chair straight into the air to pull its leg out of the rope binding his foot. Then he threw it against the wall, where it smashed into more pieces than Amanda's. The murderous giant clumped down the stairs, powdered snow melting on his shoulders. He eyed the remaining family members as he passed by the living room, trudging into the kitchen. Wayne and Amanda both dove for Amos's bindings, but they barely touched him before a sound like a moose spun them back around. The man stood at the end of the room already, now holding the squash which had been on the dining room table. Wayne dove forward and picked up the sharpest piece of Amanda's chair within reach, the end of one of the legs. The giant eyed him, but remained mute. He then pointed at Amanda and gestured for her to step over to the window. She held tighter to Amos instead, and the man shrugged. Then he pointed at Wayne and held up the squash in his other hand before throwing it at him like a football. Wayne reacted instinctively, holding up the sharp piece of wood he'd chosen as a weapon. Mostly by sheer luck, the squash impacted the sharp end of the leg and was impaled there. A weak stream of orange juice leaked down to Wayne's fingers. The giant snorted like a bull and nodded. Then he stepped forward. Wayne shook the squash off and raised the chair leg again, but when he swung at the giant, he caught the leg and ripped it out of Wayne's hands. Amanda ran forward, but the giant simply smacked her away, knocking her down to one knee. Wayne dove for another weapon, but the giant caught him by the throat and hoisted him off his feet before slamming him to the ground. Straddling Wayne, he raised the broken chair leg above his head, pointed end down. Amanda looked away. When the giant's arms slammed down, so did Amos's eyelids. But with his hands bound, he could not cover his ears or his nose. He could not block out the broken egg sounds his father's head was making, or the mushroomy smell that filled the room. His mother made an inhuman noise beside him and collapsed flat on the floor where, strangely, she started snoring. The giant stood up and walked over to them. Amos kept his eyes closed as he heard his mother's unresponsive body being dragged away. For a long time, Amos sat with his eyes closed and his head hanging while he waited alone in the living room, surrounded by death. A pillowed whimper burst through the top of his duct tape. The warm air of his breath breezed over a tear running down his cheek. The room was getting cold. This was because when the giant dragged Amanda out the front door, totally unconscious, he'd left the door open behind him, stripping Amos of protection from even the cold. Outside, he heard his mother start screaming. That was good. It meant she was still alive. It meant she might still escape and come save him. Amos heard the van start in the garage. That was good. It meant Mommy got away. It meant she was coming for him and they were going to leave. They would get help for Conrad and Rosemary and... Amos wanted desperately to believe his father could be saved, but even his innocent mind could not allow for that hope. But as the van's engine roared, Amanda's screams grew louder. She was not inside the van, as Amos had hoped and expected. But had he really expected it? His suspicion had been triggered when the vile giant bludgeoned Conrad's head with his baseball bat, the very same way Conrad had bashed in the first squash. And he had just listened to his father meet the same end as the squash the giant had thrown at him. He assumed, because he had not seen Rosemary's squash, that she must have thrown it off the roof. And he had seen evidence of the squash destroyed by his mother. Its flesh and seeds were smeared all over the garage floor after she backed over it with the van, violently yet effortlessly crushing it to a pulp. And now, Amos heard the van's low engine growl rise suddenly in pitch, just before his mother's screams were silenced. The tears came unhindered after Amos realized he was truly alone. His shoulders fell as far forward as they could with the ropes binding him to the chair. He didn't have enough energy to try to escape. His small body felt like 1,000 pounds, and the white landscape outside might as well have been an ocean. He knew he had no chance of finding help out there if he escaped. The best he would be able to do would be call the police. But how long would it take them to get to him? It was not a question of how many minutes, but hours. The bloodied giant walked past the picture window some minutes after the van had gone silent. His breath clouded around his face. He came up to the porch step and through the front door, finally shutting it behind him. Then he just stood in the entryway, staring at Amos, assessing him. Amos met his eyes, hoping against hope to find a glimmer of mercy. He did not. The man appeared to arrive at some decision and crossed the room in long, heavy strides. Amos looked away from him, squeezing his eyes closed in anticipation of the next great horror. But all the man did was turn his chair around and drag him across the room to the front door. Amos peeked when he felt his chair settle again. From his new angle, he could see through the window that the giant, for it could not have been anyone else, had set his daddy's 14-foot ladder against the porch roof. The giant opened the front door again, and this time he dragged Amos backwards through it. The cold, which had made him uncomfortable inside, now bit at his exposed skin, inducing needle-like pain wherever it touched. The man made no effort to make his bumpy ride down the front steps comfortable either. He dragged Amos all the way to the base of the ladder and stopped. Amos accidentally glanced toward Rosemary's still form, face down in the yard. She had not moved even slightly since landing there. He cried and yelled as loud as he could to see if he could wake her, but she did not respond. The giant began to climb the ladder and, impossibly, drag Amos and his chair up behind himself. Including the chair, Amos must have weighed almost 100 pounds, yet the enormous killer showed no strain as he carried him up to the roof. Amos had to squeeze his eyes shut again as the ground grew further away with each rung. If the giant's grip gave out, if the chair slipped from his hand, Amos would be helpless to stop his fall or control his landing. Again, he involuntarily glanced at Rosemary, sprawled in the snow. On the porch roof, the man set Amos down. The slight grade and the slick snow made precarious ground. Amos dared not twitch or even shiver, lest he slide to his doom while the giant pulled the ladder up and set it against the second-story roof. He repeated the same process, hauling Amos up to the very peak of the roof. Amos dared not struggle. He tried to guess what the man had planned for him. Conrad, bat. Rosemary, throne. Wayne, chair leg. Amanda, the van. Amos retraced his memories, but the only squash he remembered finding had been the one he hid. He had spared it from destruction, hadn't he? Just as he himself had been spared so far. So why had the man brought him up to the roof? What was he doing all this exhausting work for? The man spun Amos around and set his chair down on all four legs, but did not let go. If he had, the chair undoubtedly would have tumbled off of the angled roof. After being turned around, Amos saw exactly why he had been brought to the roof. And yes, it did have to do with how he handled his squash. Protruding from the roof in front of him stood the old brick chimney. His fear of falling held Amos still as the giant unbound him from the chair. Even after all four of his limbs were free, he dared not stand, even though he knew a fall awaited him in the near future if he did nothing. He decided to try running for it. He hoped Rosemary's window was still open, because if he could get back down to the porch roof, her window could be his portal to temporary safety. He rose from the chair, but the giant kicked it into the back of his knees, making him sit back down. The giant then grabbed his shoulders, lifted him, and kicked the chair off the back of the roof. It shattered on the driveway below. Amos kicked. He screamed. The giant walked him towards the chimney. Amos's struggling slowed him down but did not prevent him from lifting the boy above the top of the spout. Amos grabbed the sides of the chimney to prevent himself from falling in, but the giant reached in and pushed down on his forehead, which only took up about half of his enormous palm. Amos clung to the edge for a few seconds before plummeting into the blackness below. The Chesley murders remained unsolved for 23 years, until 2017 when an enterprising young detective retested some samples for DNA which would have been undetectable by the methods and equipment of the past. The positive result which came back created a bittersweet reaction. The sample matched to an unidentified man who had been shot and killed with a double-barreled shotgun during a home invasion in 1995, 7 months after the Chesley murders. While this meant their case could now be closed and the public could stop fearing the merciless killer's return, it was also disappointing that he could not be punished for his brutal crimes. Most agreed his death had come too quickly, too easily. This sentiment was most passionately expressed in an interview on Dateline NBC with Rosemary and Amos Chesley, the sole survivors of the Butternut Butcher, an unfortunate nickname which had arisen after they shared their first-hand accounts with a magazine. Lester Holt respected them enough to avoid the popular moniker during their Dateline interview, though. Rosemary described to millions of viewers hidden behind the cameras how she had woken up half-frozen and dizzy over an hour after being thrown from the porch roof. She'd sustained a broken wrist, collarbone, and rib, which thankfully did not puncture her lung. She could barely walk, mostly due to cold, but she forced herself to hobble to the porch and up the stairs to the front door, which remained open. Inside, she heard what would have otherwise been Amos's final cries coming from the fireplace. She could not pull him through, but she shoved a broom handle up into the chimney, which she used to push against the bottom of Amos's foot and help him wriggle above the narrow section which nearly suffocated him. He would have died and likely rotted for a while, undiscovered, just like a squash hidden in cinder blocks. Amos discussed his theories about their family's murderer, a subject which had occupied more of his mind than he cared to admit. His best theory characterized the man as a psychotic vagrant, probably traveling along the nearby highway and camping out in random barns and sheds. Amos thinks the freakishly large man hid underneath their porch one night and decided to stay because of the plentiful food from the garden. When they harvested everything before the storm and gave it all away, the man snapped, since in his mind, the garden had become his. Immediately following the rescue of the Chesley children, Rosemary called 911 as soon as Amos could breathe again. Their house was thoroughly searched. Under the porch, police found countless vegetable stems and rinds, apple cores, and wrappers taken out of the Chesleys' bin. They also found the end of the garden hose, which the man had probably used to drink from whenever he could sneak out to turn it on. Lester asked, "Why the squashes? Do you think he planned to kill you all along and he was allowing you to choose how? That sounds rather premeditated for a random vagrant, doesn't it?" "We've thought about that a lot," said Rosemary. "Yeah, it's really bothered me," Amos admitted, looking down. After a pause, he looked back up. "You know, I'm not sure if this is any less disturbing, but the more I think about it, I think he was just messing with us for fun. I mean, think about it. He was living under our porch all day, only coming out at night, most likely. He probably got bored. I think he enjoyed watching us, seeing how we reacted to finding those squashes, you know? He was really sick." To Rosemary, Lester asked, "And you say when you woke up, he was just gone," Rosemary finished. "He thought we were all dead, or," she looked at Amos, "on our way there. He ended up ditching our van up the road after it got stuck in the snow, and from there, well, who knows how many porches he slept under or barns he hid out in before that farmer blew him away. Sorry, I don't mean to be crass, it's just good riddance." Lester Holt nodded, then launched into a scripted wrap-up his producers fed him through the teleprompter. Rosemary smiled obediently, waiting for the light indicating they were live to go dim. Amos stared blankly off-screen, entirely distracted by the show running in his mind. If you watch the Dateline recording closely, you can see his lips move as if on their own. It doesn't take an expert lip reader to understand him silently repeating his sister's words. Good riddance. And out of nowhere, he appears to relax, as if he had been tied to the interview chair, and suddenly felt his bindings release. You made it out. Congratulations. If you enjoyed the story, please rate, like, review, or subscribe. For ad-free episodes and bonus Into the Woods episodes, become a patron with the link in the description. You can also support the show by buying merch. That link is also in the description below. To stay up to date, follow me on Instagram at The Warning Woods. If you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.